inspired, fired up, and on the move. Yeah, 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 yeah. From all the places and all the races, arm in arm now, upon our feet. Yeah, 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 yeah. From all the schools and all the homes, it's time to take it. It's time to take it to the street.
Gonna get militant up in here. Hello, once again. Great to have all of you, our friends, with us on this episode of The Call, the program that calls you to direct action, calls you to organize, calls you to advocate, and do whatever you need to do so that we can have better communities and a better world. And we have one of one of the people we really like, and my wife, I have to say, my wife Varys really loves our guests. She always talks about the fact that she would love to see her again, and she would love for her to come visit us in Florence again. She's a super fan of Mary Ann Williamson, who is an author, who is a spiritual teacher, and who I feel is one of the greatest human beings in this country and perhaps the world. And I really resonate with her and what one of our guests said, that we are spiritual beings who are having a human experience, not human beings who are having a spiritual experience. And so no other than Mary Ann Williamson, former candidate for the presidency of the United States, is our guest on this episode of The Call. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction. Right back at you, by the way.
Okay, thank you. And so many things are going on. Um, I'll just be transparent. You were a guest at our church. We did some things at in the community. You were one of the few presidential candidates. You were the only presidential candidate who actually took our environmental justice tour. I was thinking of one other candidate who sent a family member. And we felt that was really important. And, when you look at rural communities and, low wealth communities, that candidates just don't visit traditional places and the places where they think they'll garner the most votes. And so our guests, I'm sure, are interested, like I am, what set you on the path that you're on? And you're a fantastic author. You decided to run for president, and I'm sure you're doing so many great and wonderful things today. So can you kind of tell people about your life journey and how did you come to the place that you are now?
Thank you. There are two things that you talked about there, and I want to first talk about the environmental justice issue, which, as you said, I brought up on the debate stage, and I do think this was the first. Like reparations, it was the first when Don Lemon asked me some question about Flint, and I said, "Are you kidding? It's not just Flint; it's all over this country." The answer to that question is that people such as yourself in South Carolina showed me. Until I went to South Carolina, I didn't realize the racial prejudice that was involved in so many environmental issues. I had not realized about toxic dumps. I had not realized about factories that spewed toxins. I had not realized how often it was that these kinds of places were put in disadvantaged communities that did not have the political power to fight back, which once again I talked about on the debate stage. But the answer to the question is that people such as yourself, Reverend Woodbury, showed me. And that's really the value of political campaigns. You go into places and you listen to the people. and you really learn. And it's really a good thing because by the time someone is elected to a position, they will have really learned what's going on in this country. It's pretty profound what you learn. I also learned a lot about the PFAS in New Hampshire that's being talked about now. So the answer to that is that people told me about it, namely people such as yourself in South Carolina. In terms of the larger picture, I was raised by a father and a mother, but by a father specifically who had been raised in poverty in this country. And he had a lot of feelings about that. He was very committed to social justice. He was an immigration lawyer. He also took us all over the world traveling. So as a child, I was exposed to many things that I think a lot of kids are not exposed to. And as a matter of fact, you know, when my father used to take us traveling all over the world, there's a story he used to tell all the time. People would say, "Why are you taking them? They're so young, they won't remember it." And my father used to say, "It will get under their skin." And he was so correct. When you learn as a child to experience that people are the same everywhere, there's a lot of political propaganda you're just not vulnerable to later in life. Because you knew as a child, well, they're no different than us. And I then became, you know, I went to college at a time, you know, during the 60s and 70s, the whole cultural revolution, everything from the civil rights movement to the anti-war movement was happening at the same time as a kind of spiritual flowering. We used to read people like Ram Dass in the morning and go to anti-war protests in the afternoon. I felt for a long time that my greatest contribution was in the spiritual teaching metaphysics. I was always a political activist, always committed to those things, but I felt that the spiritual aspect of human change, which underlies political change, was really where I could be of most value. What I started to see though over the last 20 years, my career started 37, 38 years ago. So I felt privileged and blessed to be in work where I was there for people in their darkest hours. But what I started seeing, and I know you know this very well, what I started seeing about 20 years ago was how many people were going through terrible times that were not quote unquote acts of God. It wasn't a cancer diagnosis. It wasn't that a tree fell on their house. It was bad public policy. They worked hard, they did everything right, and they still couldn't make ends meet. They worked hard, they did everything right, and they were loaded by college loan debt. They worked hard and they did everything right, and they still didn't make enough money that they could rent the 2-bedroom apartment. Or as you were saying, they did everything right, but they're breathing toxins and they're drinking chemicals in their water. Things that were the result of a viciously unjust economic and political system, the consequences of which were deep despair and anxiety and depression and genuine harm upon millions and millions of people. And then the system dumps those people in the laps of people like you and me and says, here, make their lives better. No, you stop harming them. Don't just harm them and then say to ministers and rabbis and priests and imams and therapists, oh, make them feel better. The mental health issue here is you guys. You guys. So I thought, you know, I had, as I'm sure you have as well, I had advised quite a few politicians, and you get to the point of feeling like, I can't advise you anymore. You don't get it. Just move out of that chair and let me sit there.
I always love your passion. And I actually, I preach and teach because I'm a pastor, I through a metaphysical lens often because people don't understand that there's a spirit that actually manifests itself in the physical world. Now, how I explain it to people is depending on your spirit. If you have a bad spirit, then you're going to have bad feelings. If you have bad feelings, you're going to have bad thoughts. If you have bad thoughts, you're going to do bad things. And vice versa. If you have a good spirit, then you're going to have good feelings. You're going to have good thoughts, and thoughts are actually, they are what causes deeds. So when you talk about craziness or evil and a lot of the problems that we have in the world, they are rooted in people's spirit, and we like to equate spirit with what happens, when you're the spirit of your high school or college football team. But it's much more than that. And what we feel in our spirit, what we feel with our emotions, what we think about is what manifests itself on the physical plane. So that's something that I wish more people would think about and not think that things, as you said, just happen to them. And another thing, excuse me, that attracted me to your work is your position on reparations. And I was blessed to attend the United Nations Conference on Xenophobia and Racism in Durban, South Africa, and 16,000 people of color came together. And we talked about how there should be reparations for those who were enslaved and those who suffered under the vicious restrictions of colonialism. And, part of that is in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt started with the United Nations. But unfortunately, when the conference ended in August, and we all came back to the States and our respective countries ready to organize around reparations, 9/11 happened and overshadowed everything that these 16,000 people from around the world have lifted up. And so, if you don't mind, let's share with us a little bit about reparations, because that issue has been rising and growing in the United States. And I actually, I'm going to be attending a conference where I've been invited to speak and do some training. And reparations is really important. It's not just because I'm an African in the diaspora, but it's important because people, when they are restricted, enslaved, etc., lose things that impact them for generations. And so, if you don't mind, speak to that, because you were the only candidate that really stood, had a position on that issue.
The basis of my political beliefs are my spiritual convictions. The laws of spirit are the laws of consciousness, like you were saying. It's all about the mind. Psychology, as we know of psychology, didn't exist. When Jesus said, "My kingdom is within, my kingdom is not of this world," that's what he was talking about, the kingdom of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And all that a nation is a group of people. So the things which apply to the spiritual journey or the journey of consciousness of one person applies to the life of a nation. And in the life of a person, if you've done wrong, you atone for what you've done. You atone for your sin. And you seek to make amends. And God is all merciful. And once you do that, you are given the opportunity to begin again. But until you do that, the consequences of your wrong thinking will remain with you.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1998, I published a book called Healing the Soul of America. And in order to prepare for writing that book, I took a deeper dive into American history, the study of American history, than I ever had before. Now, I was raised in a liberal home. I was certainly raised with an understanding of the civil rights movement. My parents were very left-wing, et cetera. So I had that. But it wasn't until I did that deeper study for that book that I realized the deeper dimensions of economic restitution that had still not been made. And I realized that while the Voting Rights Act was extremely important, which of course has since been gutted, while civil rights legislation was very important to dismantle the Black Code laws by which subpar economic and political and social opportunity was granted to Black people through segregation. I also realized that the issue that Martin Luther King was still, in addition to militarism, which he was calling the country out on, which I personally think was a large part of why he was assassinated, there was the economic piece. And when I read more about our history, and I read that, you know, the first slave ships brought over in 1619, which means that at the end of the Civil War, 1865, there had been almost 250 years of slavery. That at the end of the Civil War, historians believe there were anywhere from 4 to 5 million enslaved people. I learned that they had been promised by Tecumseh Sherman 40 acres and a mule for every formerly enslaved family of 4. Now, I had heard the term 40 acres and a mule, but I'd never really thought deeply about what that meant to someone who is told you're not a slave anymore, but where are you supposed to go? Where are you supposed to live? How are you supposed to grow food, make a living, be able to feed your family? Reading about the 12 years of possibility during Reconstruction, then how after the Northern troops left, all hell broke loose again, following, so that at the end of the Civil War, there was practically another 100 years of institutionalized violence towards Black people. I knew, but I didn't know. There were a lot of pieces that hadn't fallen together for me. Now, I'm Jewish, and I'm very aware of the Holocaust, very aware, as I think we are all called upon to be aware of the dramas of our ancestors. And one of the things that I know as a Jew is the reparations that Germany has made to Jewish organizations. That Germany has paid $89 billion, roughly, to Jewish organizations. Germany has done a full-on mea culpa. There's no, well, kind of I didn't do it thing going on in Germany towards the Jews. Now, Germany, the war was over in 1945. And I think that reparations has been a large part, not just of the financial restitution, but of emotional and psychological healing between Germany and the Jews of Europe. I mean, you have Jews who've come back to Munich, you have synagogues. I mean, it's quite something. We have a war that ended in 1865, and we're still passing the baton of toxicity, one generation to another. So once I saw that, I realized that, you know, my whole book, Healing the Soul of America, was about how we're not going to heal this country until we heal on a soul level. And when you have sinned, you must atone. You know, I'm Jewish, we have Yom Kippur, Catholics go to confession. In AA, which is a spiritual program, it's a program of amends. You can't have a real healing without owning your mistakes and trying to make them right. And this country will not be healed until we deal with this. And I had a plan, which I think was the best. I don't think anybody really has a plan. I knew John Conyers. He was a friend of mine because I raised my daughter in Michigan. But when John introduced HR 40, it was quite a few years ago, and that was about studying. So even now, when you hear most lawmakers talk about reparations in Congress, we're going to have a study. Reverend Woodbury, we don't really need to gather any more evidence. We have the evidence. We need to start putting money on the table, talking about the plan, and moving forward that way. And I was proud to, I don't know about proud, but happy to have the opportunity to talk about this on a national stage and to play whatever part I might have played in opening the conversation.
Oh, yes, wonderful. And that's one of the sticking points, you know, people, and I often talk to people about the fact that if African Americans or former slaves are truly free, if we have rights, but the roots of the system still say that we're not fully human, we're 3/5 of a person. It still says, as happened in the Dred Scott decision, Justice Taney in his decision saying to the escaped slave who was in a free area, Black men and women have no rights that white people are bound to respect. And we see that, and like, you know, we had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment passed about rights and voting after the Civil War. Then we had to go back and have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed for people of African descent again. And now here we are right now trying to pass the John Lewis bill to ensure that people of African descent who were slaves have the right to vote. And so when people talk about dismantling institutional racism, and they believe that this can be done only by addressing the problems of white superiority and white privilege, I often sit there and say, no, this is really not the answer if we don't, address the issues of economic inequality and injustice. As you said, there were 12 million people, Malcolm X said, who were slaves who landed on the shores of this nation, not counting people who died during the Middle Passage. When the Civil War was over, there were 4 million Blacks who were alive. 8 million died just through slavery. And just imagine, if you can, being set free with no home, no money, no land, no way of feeding yourself, having been some of the people who built our nation's capital, built up the economy, helped to build the intercontinental railroad system. And I think it's atrocious for people to believe that no compensation needs to be made. And as you said, Germany did so to the tune of $89 billion. But that, that leads us to what's going on in the country today. And not just with African Americans, but the pushback that we have around dealing with the issues of climate change, the pushback about, minimizing the amount of money that's going to be spent on infrastructure while we have buildings and roads and bridges falling apart. And so, I'd like to get your take on that. How can we, it's amazing to me that we can actually see what's happening around us, but lack the vision to craft and see a better future. As you know, what the Bible says, when there is no vision, the people perish, and people are perishing. And we see that with the pandemic. People are literally perishing because of a lack of vision. So share, we talked about the past. Let's talk a little bit about the future, and let's talk about the present and what's going on now in this country.
One of the things I talked about on my campaign was children. And one of the issues of childhood that's so important is education. About 20 years ago, our system became almost obsessed by STEM, science and technology and engineering and math. And we were going to teach our children science and technology and engineering and math because this would enable them to have better jobs. This was done often at the expense of the humanities, culture, and history. We have 10 states in this country who don't even require half a year of study of American history and civics and government. Now, if children are not taught as a child at a very young age what the Bill of Rights is, how are they to know to be appalled as adults when the Bill of Rights is under an assault? That's number one. But also, our kids aren't being taught history. What I knew about I don't know what I was actually taught about civil rights, but I certainly had enough of a basis. But too many people in today's world, what I would see when I was running is not that I felt all Americans were so racist, because that was not my experience of the average American. What I experienced when I would be talking to all white audiences, the subject of reparations would come up and they'd be kind of like this. And then I would simply give a thumbnail sketch of history, much like I gave a couple of minutes ago. What happened in 1619, 250 years, 4 million enslaved, formerly enslaved people at the end, nowhere to go, an economic gap that has never been closed, etc. And I found in white audience, all white audience after all white audience, including, by the way, in South Carolina and in Iowa and in New Hampshire, was that at the end, you have people jumping on their feet, standing ovation, let's do it, let's do it. So I think a large part of this, Reverend Woodbury, is a terrible failure of the American educational system. I read the other day that a third of Americans don't understand that the Holocaust happened. What are we teaching? How can anybody grow up? And I remember, I'm sure you remember, several years ago, there was a big deal with Houghton Mifflin and the book, the history books, and Texas Board of Education didn't want to include it. I think Martin Luther King in the Civil Rights Movement is given a paragraph. So I think a large part of it is a terrible, terrible ignorance, not stupidity, but ignorance. I think that there are first principles on which this country stands. But if people are not taught what those first principles are, if they're not etched on the heart of every generation, then they begin to lose their moral force. You know, either we do or we do not take seriously the idea that all men are created equal. Now, we all know that the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson. All men are created equal. Those words were written by a slave owner. We get that. We all understand that 41 out of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. We get that. But we don't honor them for what they were able to achieve in their lifetime, but we do honor the principles that they bequeathed to us, which are the basis of our being able to fix it. So I think, Reverend Woodbury, a lot of Americans need to read a book on American history. You know, I went into a used bookstore once, and there was a book called American History for Dummies. And I picked it up, and it was like really good. It was just like, could we revisit the basics here? The second issue, of course, and also I want to say something. You had talked before about the Voting Rights Act. This is another place in history where I think too many people are unaware. In 1965, when Martin Luther King stood there and watched Lyndon Johnson sign the Voting Rights Act, several years ago, the John Roberts led Supreme Court began to gut the Voting Rights Act. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her dissent, said, in 1965, or I forget which was 64 and which was 65, one was the Civil Rights Act, one was the Voting Rights Act. She said they built a very strong umbrella. And Roberts said, we don't need it anymore. The South has changed. She said, mark my word, you are poking holes in the umbrella. And as soon as we poke those holes, the rain will start dripping through. And that's exactly what happened with voter suppression bills. They have even gutted it further. At this point, practically taken it away. Like you said, we need to talk about what's happening now. The voter suppression bills that are happening all over this country. And by the way, as I'm sure you're well aware, it's not just voter suppression bills, it's also voter nullification bills. And for the life of me, I do not understand why the Democrats are not acting with greater urgency. I don't understand it. I don't understand why Vice President Harris and President Biden talk about how we're going to out-organize the Republicans. That will not be enough to handle this. I don't understand why they're not behaving with greater urgency. If they do not, I fear terrible consequences in 2022. If the consequences are 2022, we could have a disaster in 2024 that could actually spell the end of the American experiment, nothing less.
Wow. And I think you said several things that are important. And when you talk about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, some of the things that are driving this country into the divisive direction that it is currently in, and perhaps heading even further off of a cliff. You know, I was listening to Gil Scott-Heron's song "Winter in America," and he describes democracy as ragtag on the corner. wishing for some rain. And I think part of it is one, it's rooted in race and power. So, you know, you get people who they look at the fact that 41% of the country it now is comprised of people of color. And people are afraid that that may mean losing power. The other thing is that when we look at, and I'm so glad you raised a point that just really activated my thinking. When we look at our youth, and a lot of education in this country has been predicated on how that benefits businesses and the economic system. So when America was predominantly an agrarian society, that's what we were teaching people. You know, we were teaching them, hey, how do you farm? You know, we had 4-H clubs and all of that. And then when we moved into the industrial era and manufacturing, and we saw a lot of tech schools, you know, so because they needed people on those assembly lines. And, you know, now that business, and we see this every day, we see it with the technology, we see it with computers and automation and robotics. Now they're saying we need STEM. We need to be able, not so much to educate people so that we work on making our country better, the world better, our communities better, but how do we train people to once again serve the economic system and the companies, the corporations that pretty much run this country through the stock market and through the economic power that they have. And I think that has a lot to do with the direction that's going on. You know, we look at Citizens United and the fact that companies can give money to political parties and candidates determines, you know, to a large extent who's in power, what political ideologies have control and you know have control and are predominant, you know, in our country. And we're seeing it not only in the United States, we're seeing this globally. And so I think you really came up with some really good points where, in terms of education, our children in the future, they are not being trained to understand civics. You know, I've seen people vote in primaries, and when they were asked, "Are you going to turn out to vote in the general election?" actually said, "I thought the candidate already won." They didn't understand the difference between a primary being where people run candidates in one political party and the general election when you run against candidates in a different party or parties. And so we have how do we fix that? How do we fix that when the American economy is driving in a direction where it's like, let's serve the rich, let's serve the corporation, and talking about climate change and our lack of responsiveness. You know, our dream was to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by, you know, 2035, 2030. We're not going to make that because corporations isn't really in their interest, you know. So, go ahead.
Well, like you said, we have an educational system that serves the economy, and we should have an educational system that serves our democracy and serves our people and serves our planet. We have got to shift from a bottom line of economic values to a bottom line of humanitarian values, because the economic organizing principle that we bow down to and that we serve and that our government defers to and that our educational system defers to is not an economic system that is valuable to the majority of people on the planet anyway. It's only of value to a small group of people. Now, And as I said before, this is often at the expense of the attention and the resources given to educating our children for how to serve our democracy and how to serve each other and how to serve future generations. When you say, what are we going to do about this? It's a moral awakening. It's a spiritual awakening. It's an intellectual awakening. It's an emotional awakening. It's a psychological awakening that I do believe is happening. It's happening now. The issue is it happening fast enough? And is it happening big enough in order to stave off the disasters which are closer than I think most people even realize? The planet is burning now. We lost a town in California last night. Gone. Greenville, just gone. The catastrophes, the weather catastrophes that have been predicted are happening now.
Yeah.
When you have billionaires whose idea of how to plan for their future is to learn how to escape the planet, then you know that you're in big trouble. Now, you and I share. You and I recognize each other because you and I are very similar in our orientation. We have great passion for these political issues, but it's based on a knowledge of how consciousness operates, which is spirituality. And we are people of faith. This country has seen miracles before. People who wanted to abolish slavery, it would have been, that'll be a miracle. Well, yeah, really, because they did it. Women who said institutionalized oppression of women is not okay. Women should have the vote. People go, that'll take a miracle. Well, guess what? It happened. People who said we need to dismantle segregation. People said, that'll take a miracle. That'll happen. Well, guess what? It happened. So as much as the United States from our founding has demonstrated in very violent ways our willingness to transgress against our own principles in which we purport to stand, whether it's slavery, genocide of Native Americans, institutionalized suppression of women, gay people, etc., we also have a history of self-correction. The arc of the moral universe is long, does bend towards justice, and does bend towards justice in this country. Now, we also know, you and I, we're not in denial. We also know that sometimes we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. Mass incarceration doesn't just mean we weren't going forward, we were going backwards. There are many ways in which we have demonstrated, even in our own time, not only a failure to make right what had been made wrong, but a willingness to make new things wrong. But I think people are waking up. I do think people are waking up. And I think the next thing that we have to wake up to is the fact that one of the reasons people are so divided is because the political parties are not as divided as they'd like you to think. 2-party duopoly. And what you saw the other day in Ohio with Shontel Brown and Nina Turner says it all. I'm sorry. You talked about being a progressive, and you know as well as I know that it's not the conservatives which are obstructing progressive action at this point. You have the Democratic elite, establishment elite, including, with all due respect, I don't need to tell you, someone from your own state who's very much a part of that. So right now, I think many of us, particularly after the election the other night in Ohio, are sitting with this, with a lot of questions in our heart. I would like you and your listeners to know I have endorsed progressive primary candidates. You were talking about the difference between the primaries and the election. We need to get people on the level of the primary. This was unheard of. This was an example. The fact that the Democratic establishment leadership took such an interest in a primary campaign. They want to cut off the progressives at the primary level. I think they feel that the squad got in, outmaneuvered them, and they don't want any more of that nonsense the way they see it. I'm sure you saw Hakeem Jeffries' comments today. So we have to do everything we're doing, do it more, say it louder. Every podcast, every article, every election, people can go to candidatesummit.com to see some of the people that I have endorsed. And I think it's all on the level of human relationship. You and I are an example. We met, we recognize each other. I'm on your podcast, you'll be on mine. You had, that's where it's happening. It's on level of people recognize each other and how we can come together and work in such a way that our effect is exponential.
Absolutely. And, it starts on the grassroots level. And even when, I don't care what side you look at, but it starts on the grassroots level. So, you know, you look at what happened with the civil rights movement and the freedom schools. They were called freedom schools that taught people what they needed to do to register to vote, that taught people about policy and how to organize and those sorts of things. And then during the Black Power movement, they called them liberation schools. And then you have, you know, women's studies didn't begin in colleges. Women were gathering together and educating themselves and talking about the issues. And we've seen the same thing happen on both political sides. So, you know, you see the evolution of people doing homeschooling who are motivated by certain ideological stances. And then that turned into, you know, private schools and charter schools. And so I think we often look towards these big policy changes. We expect people in certain positions to turn things around when really major change, you know, that, like as you said, the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the marriage and gay marriage equality movement, all began on the grassroots level. And it's sometimes frustrating to go on the internet and see all these letters, you know, sign this letter, sign this position, petition, sign this, sign that, and let's give it to the power brokers rather than understanding that in a democracy, which comes from the Greek word, you know, demos meaning people, and then the rule of the people, that we are giving away our power. We're not organizing in communities. We're not organizing on the grassroots level. What we want to do is talk about it. You know, we want to have another conference call, another summit, form another working group, have another panel discussion, talking about the problems and continuously asking people, how do we engage with communities when the answer is to go into communities and make the changes? And I'm sure you agree with that.
Well, absolutely. I think it's a big both and. It's um, it's personal change and it's political change. It's grassroots activism and trying to change things on the level of the federal. I think that for a lot of people on the left, there has been a uh, terrible failure to recognize how important state offices are and local offices are. So I think that sometimes people on the left like to show up for the hot and sexy presidential campaigns, but don't pay as much attention as they might to things on where some of the most nefarious stuff is going on. Some of the, you know, when you're talking about the voter suppression laws, when you're talking about the voter nullification laws, these are happening on the level of the state legislatures. Now, there are things about it that they can do in Washington, but that goes back to what we were saying before. I don't know why they're not doing it with greater urgency. But you're right, it's also the level of the grassroots activism. But that grassroots activism cannot leave out electoralism. I find, Reverend, that people I know, I'll give you an example. Hakeem Jeffries, who is running, and is just saying terrible things about progressives. He started a super PAC to protect moderate incumbents from challenges by the progressives. He said things today about how, you know, his interpretation of Nina Turner's electoral defeat is the progressives can just like forget any power. Well, there's a woman named Queen Johnson who's running against him. And I don't know, I find it frustrating when I see so many people on social media who are interested in these progressive issues, are passionate about them. Like you said, they're signing petitions, but then when you say so-and-so is running as a progressive on those issues in your district, they don't necessarily get involved. And I find that unfortunate because we can't give up on that level. And I say that as someone very aware of how rigged the system is, but still you get in there because every campaign gains an inch of ground if you stand on something truthful.
Yes, and there's another thing where dollars, money,
Well,
has become so influential.
well, that's the cancer
both-
underlying all the other cancers. And of course, beginning in the 70s when the Supreme Court deemed money free speech, and then of course climaxing with the hideous Citizens United decision. I mean, look what happened with Nina Turner the other day. This was all dark money. And the fact that, corporate and lobbyist money can come in there and just be used to flood the airwaves. Unlimited. That's what Citizens United did. We need a constitutional amendment that establishes public funding for federal campaigns. Money should have nothing, zilch, nada, niet, nothing to do with who governs us. Can you imagine what a different country we would be today?
Absolutely.
If money wasn't in the equation. Can you imagine?
Yes, absolutely. But I was going to say, I also see things happening on the other side where money is becoming very influential and what work gets done and doesn't get done. And I'm talking, and I'm a great supporter. We have philanthropic partners that we couldn't get the work done without them. But in a lot of cases, they are so disconnected with what's going on in communities and on the ground that they'll decide, oh, we're going to just put millions of dollars, we'll make millions of dollars available to deal with this issue. And what happens with that is that you'll have, and I know you've seen it, I've seen it, you'll see organizations that desperately need money and are doing good things with money, but they will change the direction of their work. They'll have mission drift because they're chasing the dollars. And the dangerous thing about that is that just as money controls politics on one side, when money is the thing that is driving change, then money actually determines what work gets done in communities and the destiny of those communities. So an example is if a major problem in many communities, a major problem in many communities is gun violence. But if the philanthropic community decides we really don't want to fund that because we think something else is hot and sexy and it's in the newspapers and the policymakers are working on it, and we think that will allow us to make a lot of change, that issue doesn't get dealt with, and you have people in communities who could do greater work, but they don't have the financial wherewithal, to make the change that communities need. And so I think money has become such a priority and a driving force in what happens in this country on both sides of the aisle or both sides of the political spectrum, to mix metaphors, that it is really hampering the changes that we need in this country.
Absolutely. There's a man named Anand Giridharadas who talks about this. There is no amount of private charity, and everybody talks about these philanthropic gazillionaires. Well, I'm sorry, there's no amount of private charity that can compensate for a basic lack of social justice. And sometimes, people get, oh, that philanthropic organization gave 100,000, that person's foundation gave $1 million, but that person is saving millions on the tax cuts that are being given to that bracket of wealth. So we need a wealth tax, and like you and I have been saying, we need to take money out of the equation.
Right.
It is killing us. It is killing us. When you have short-term profit maximization for chemical companies and food companies and agricultural companies and big oil companies and big pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies and gun manufacturers and defense contractors taking precedence over the safety and the health and well-being of people and animals and planet for no other reason than that our government has become a legal system of legalized bribery and a handmaiden to the corporate donors who flood campaigns, such as we just saw in Ohio, then you're talking about a country that's not, this is not a sustainable, survivable trajectory for our democracy and possibly even for our species.
Mhm. And the thing is that the voices of the people are not heard. You know, whether we're
Yeah,
talking,
because the money talks louder than people do.
right, whether we're talking about policy or whether we're again talking about the philanthropic community, because when people are approaching millionaires and billionaires to give money to foundations, very often the people who know the problems the best, know what community-led solutions would be most successful, are not at the table. They're not even invited to those discussions with the rich and large donors. And we wonder why we've been funding work around some issues literally for decades and scores of years, and we're not getting solutions. And so I think on both sides, as you said it so well, money speaks louder than people. And until we realize that we need the participation of the people, we need to hear the voices of the people at every level, then it's going to be just that much harder to make change. But we're getting short on time. But I want you to share something with us really quickly, and that is, I tell people all of the time, we see so many problems, so many obstacles, but we keep going, and we keep going. For me, let me speak for myself, for two reasons. One, what's the alternative if we don't fight to have a better world for everybody, human beings, natures, all creatures, big and small. And the other thing is the vision that we have. So what is your vision? What vision do you have for this country and the world?
I do believe that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I do believe that God has the final say. And I don't believe that this is the first generation that's been in trouble. You and I, Reverend Woodbury, both come from people who have a history of persecution. And we don't come from ancestors. We don't come from people who said, okay, well, there's nothing we can do. We come from ancestors who generation after generation stood up for themselves, stood up for their children, stood up for those who came before them and came after them. This is not the first generation of Americans that's been in trouble. Let's just not be the first generation of Americans who wimps out on doing what it will take to put this country back on track. And that's my vision. My vision is that we are going to rise up like other generations have done. And we're going to push back. We're going to push back against overreach by capitalism. We're going to push back by overreach by forces of greed and unfettered economic forces, which are always behind all of these things. That's what's behind slavery. That's what was behind, resistance to the labor movement. But we abolished slavery. We gave women the right to vote. We established unions. We established child labor laws. Keep your eye on that's my vision, is we keep an eye on the ball of what we want. We want a survivable world. Literally at this point, our democracy depends on it. At this point, our existence depends on it. And Reverend Woodbury, you and I are both parents. And there's a fierceness that comes up when you sense that your child might be in trouble. A fierceness, like that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. I will not allow it to happen. And I think we need some of that fierceness right now, whether it has to do with environmental degradation, whether it has to do with wealth inequality, whether it has to do with any of these trajectories that are so horrifying that if allowed to continue, they will take us down. We need that fierceness of, oh, that's not going to happen. Oh, it sure as hell isn't going to happen on my watch. And if enough of us find that place within ourselves, then we will do the grassroots activism. We will take the measures that we need to take, both in our personal lives and politically, and we will have the same kind of miracle that America's had before. Breakthroughs that nobody would have predicted, but which we can look back on and know were probably inevitable, given that love always wins.
Absolutely. The fierce urgency of now, not waiting till tomorrow, not waiting for the next generation, but the fierce urgency of now, because our planet, our civilization and democracy as we know it is under dire threat. And so running out of time, but you and I will stay in touch, and, we'll continue to work on issues together and find ourselves, when we don't talk for a while, always find ourselves in the same place with the same shared thoughts and vision. So tell people how they can get in touch with you, how they can join you.
Thank you. Well, people can go, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, and you can sign up on my mailing list at marianne.com. So I'm pretty findable.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And we look forward to doing a podcast with you.
Yes, absolutely. Very soon, actually. And
yes.
Please tell your wife I said hello.
Oh, yes, I will. I will. And I'll share it with several of our congregants too, who loved your fierce urgency of now. And they're really grateful, like myself, that we have you on the battlefield. And so for all of our guests, thank you so much for tuning in. And remember that you have been issued a call to take direct action, a call to realize that the change begins in each and every one of us, to become advocates, to become those who advocate for good policy, and those who understand that we need a spiritual change in this nation. And so until next week, this time, we'll see you again on the call. And if you want to get in touch with us, remember, you can always email us at newalphacdc@gmail.com. Stay blessed, stay empowered, and remember, in the end, the victory belongs to us. Thank you.
All the races.